We have either third-party custody or self-custody. In most cases, if not all, a single point of failure has not been eliminated because if your Bitcoin is sitting with one institution, that institution itself is a single point of failure. On the self-custody side, they run into an issue of either those personal attacks or inheritance. So, oftentimes that individual is the single point of failure.
Hey, welcome back to Bitcoin for Professionals. We got a special guest today, Cam Stromey from OnRamp Bitcoin, based out of Texas in the US. Cam, how are you doing today?
Doing really well, Ralph. How about you?
I'm doing good. I know OnRamp is based in the US, but where are you calling us from today?
From Austin, Texas.
There we go. Nice.
What many
Texas.
people would call the Bitcoin capital of the world, but I'm sure we can have a lively debate about that too.
Yeah, some would argue El Salvador just because, they took the first move. But nowadays, with all the mining happening in Texas, with talks about the strategic Bitcoin reserve, I mean, now it's really up for debate.
That's right.
But Cam, let's just dive right into it. Maybe you can walk us through your professional journey before Bitcoin. I know you've been in Bitcoin for a while, but I'm kind of curious, and I'm sure our audience are a bit curious of what did you do before Bitcoin?
I graduated in 2009, and that really colors my Bitcoin journey and how I got here because you think about that time, there were no jobs available. So, worked hard through college, and then I was, talking with, going to job fairs and talking with former colleagues or former classmates that I graduated with, and they said, "We're here, but we're not hiring." The Fortune 500 companies, like, I'm like, unbelievable. So right away, I probably had this chip on my shoulder, like many of us millennials do, that something had gone wrong in the economy, and I didn't know what at the time. It took me longer to figure that out or take the time to try to understand what happened in the Great Financial Crisis. But I got a job with a tech startup, good company in Minneapolis. I'm from Minnesota, but I didn't enjoy it. And if you look at my career, it's very extremely nonlinear. It's multidisciplinary would be the nice way to say it. And that when I look back now, uh, it's like, oh, of course I was going to work in Bitcoin, this strange new phenomenon that is in itself multidisciplinary. So after that tech job, I went to work for a dog training company. I managed the largest dog training company in Minnesota, and because I was like, I want to do something that I'm passionate about, something that I care about. Then started having a family and thought, okay, now I need to make some more money. So then went into sales and for a short time had a really interesting job. I sold numismatic coins.
Oh,
So
really?
numismatic, as you know, means collectible, right? It means like rare, scarce. So the clientele I had were very interesting. Some collected these coins because of the historical significance. Some just because that was their hobby. Some because they viewed this potentially as an investment because these are scarce. Whether these coins were hundreds of years old or from shipwrecks or were being newly minted but were really scarce. So that this is really where I learned the power of scarcity because when I would see that okay, we're this mint from China or part of the US is minting a 5 ounce gold coin. They're only minting 100 of them and there are only three in MS70 condition, which means perfect condition. They've been stamped perfectly. So only 100 total, only three out of the 100 are perfect. There's a high demand for this category of coin. Those would be sold instantly. I mean, I could pick up the phone, call my best client. It'd be a five or $10,000 coin. They would buy it, no question. So I was
Wow.
kind of amazed by that, like just the power of how scarcity uh, was by far the most important aspect of what this represented to them, whether they were looking at it from the point of view as a potential investment or from something to add to their collection. It amazed me that scarcity overall. So that kind of sticks in my mind as I think about when I eventually learned that there are only 21 million Bitcoin. That was a light bulb moment. Like, wow. So now you have the whole world has access to this new type of digital coin, and there are only 21 million for 8 billion people. Um, so I was
That's
only there
so
for about a year, like fantastic, strange experience. But that led me then to working at Oracle, where I was for about 6.5 years, and worked with some really high performing teams. As a sales professional, it's in my view, it's one of the best organizations that I could have had the opportunity to be in. It's about 150,000 person company, so very large, global. Hey, we had some of the best sales trainers in the world come and teach us, and I got to work with CFOs and executives, primarily in mid-market companies, so companies between 250 million to 2 billion in revenue, um, and just learned a lot about hardware and software through those experiences, which, if I look back again, it really helped me to understand the mechanics of Bitcoin nodes, of hardware, of open source software versus closed source software. Helped me to create a mental picture of how Bitcoin had been constructed and how it could resist all these potential attacks, and why it would have a very credible chance of continuing to be successful.
that's quite the journey. I mean, it seems like most of your career has been focused around client-facing, sales-oriented goals, collectibles. I found that extremely fascinating. I mean, usually they use coin collectors as a joke in sitcoms and stuff like that, but you kind of showed us that they should be taken seriously because it's quite the game to be played. But I really appreciate the backgrounds, very helpful. And what's interesting about that is how you've leveraged the experience in the tech sector to transition your career into Bitcoin. Now, we'll get into that, but before we get into your post Bitcoin discovery, let's talk about the discovery itself. So you said scarcity was, something that amazed you when you were working in, coin in the coin industry. But what was it? Do you recall the moment you figured out Bitcoin, the moment as a salesperson deep in tech, when you discovered it and you had your aha moment?
Like many folks, there wasn't one particular moment. There's a couple that stand out, but when I think back, kind of that trajectory, when I was in college, I went to a Ron Paul rally in Minneapolis. He was running for president. So I heard for the first time someone on stage talk about the Federal Reserve and their ability to print our money ad infinitum. And I had never heard that before. And that was definitely a milestone that, okay, I need to understand this better, but it would be years later until I really took a deep dive. 2017, I was trying to figure it out with my colleagues at Oracle. We're standing around the desk while Bitcoin is climbing up to $20,000. But it really wasn't until 2019. I remember I was on a road trip with a friend, and I thought, whatever happened to Bitcoin? Because I had bought some in that 2017 peak, didn't sell it, had forgotten about it. It was somewhere. I thought if it had died, surely I would have heard that it had died. But if it hasn't died, then why not? How is it still? Because I knew it had precipitously crashed. I just had my second child, so I had, busy with work and family and that sort of thing. So then I just started to voraciously go back into Andreas Antonopoulos videos and interviews. And for anyone who hasn't heard of Andreas Antonopoulos, one of the first and preeminent Bitcoin educators, and his presentations are still evergreen. They're really succinct, 30-minute videos you can find on YouTube. He also created a, a series of books based on those presentations called The Internet of Money. He provides wonderful analogies. He's primarily a technologist, so he really helped me, since I've been in tech as well, to put the pieces together and start to appreciate what an incredible invention Bitcoin represented.
Interesting. And so, I come a very different background from yourself. So you worked in tech on the sales side. I worked in asset management on the sales side. And for example, how I learned about Bitcoin was very different from the way you learned about Bitcoin. I think that's important to flag for the audience. Uh, you find Bitcoin in some form of way, and a lot of times for a lot of people, it's because of some form of pain that they've experienced, related to the financial system. So in my case, the total economic collapse and the hyperinflating currency and the basically evaporating savings in the banking sector in Lebanon was the trigger point. And it's funny because I've studied and I've worked in finance my entire life, and I never stopped to question, what the Fed was doing. I never wondered where, monetary supply came from, why it was changing, what interest rate did. I just understood the consequences of those changes. So there's like this huge story that they don't tell you about, this huge knowledge base that in university studies they just skip and jump straight to, okay, now you have to model every movement in the unemployment rate, interest rate, formulas. And in my case, it took a lot of unlearning to do to understand Bitcoin. I had to like debate myself, like Austrian, Keynesian, this is what I was taught. No one told me about Austrian, no one told me about Hayek, Mises, all that kind of stuff. But it's quite fascinating how people from different areas in terms of employment specialty converge towards Bitcoin once they understand it. Uh, so
If I
now
can
maybe,
ask you a question, then Ralph,
yeah.
why do you think that is? Why do you think that the modern academia for finance, for economics, does not go one level deeper to first principles or some of the root causes of some of these things?
I mean, some people would argue there's malintent, so there's some nefarious actor in the background that's enslaving everyone. I'm sure there are, but the vast majority of people working in those areas have no idea. I mean, they've been kind of brainwashed into thinking this is the only way. And I was one of those people, right? Because that's how I grew up in, and it becomes a matter of pride. And I think you need to humble yourself to really decide to see the truth and to understand the system at the base layer, which is foundational in your understanding of all the other layers of how things work in the world. I think, we've hit a point where, more from a philosophical point of view, to fund wars and to fund greedy men's ability to wage those wars, there needs to be a system mechanism that allows them to do so. And it's clear that the monetary system is the easiest way to do that. So you rig the system, and then the supply of money is within your hands, and that allows you to keep waging those wars. But I'm glad I found Bitcoin. I'm glad my family found Bitcoin back home, because in Lebanon, you can't really trust the banks anymore at all, no matter what they say, because I mean, they've done it once. Who's to say that they're not going to do it again? And so Bitcoin is actually a hedge against the system itself. A lot of people think Bitcoin will replace the system. I mean, maybe. I can't foresee the future, and I'd rather not look 20, 40, 50 years down the line. But what I do see is that Bitcoin will be the new getaway stash that you keep secure in any form of way that you choose. Some models are definitely better than other, but I feel it's going to replace gold as the, just in case the system turns against me, or just in case I need to be mobile and take, some of my wealth with me across borders. I think Bitcoin, at least at that level, I would see a 1% allocation to Bitcoin across the board. Once we hit mainstream full on adoption, everyone will have at least 1% allocated to Bitcoin in some form of way. At least that's my view. I don't know if you agree with it. I'm trying to be pragmatic and realistic because I worked in finance, and I can tell you one thing, it's not fun to try to predict what the markets are going to do or where
Hmm.
the world is headed. 9 times out of 10, you're wrong. But what you can do is try to add, a conservative forecast of a base case scenario or even a bearish case scenario. I think everyone will have some form of Bitcoin, whether 1%, 0.5%. And that's enough. If everyone had 0.5%, I mean, it's already done what it was supposed to do. Yeah, but
That's right.
I'm curious. So you worked at Oracle, you worked across all these jobs, you found Bitcoin. Did you find Bitcoin before you worked in Bitcoin? or how did that happen? You found a job in Bitcoin and then that got you really down the rabbit hole. I'd love to understand that order and how, a tech sales guy transitioned into Bitcoin and where you found yourself and what your career looked like post Bitcoin.
So I initially bought some in 2017, not a ton, but some material amount, and then, but it wasn't until 2019 when I really started to understand it, and that's when, uh, you go through that period that so many do, where I'm waking up in the middle of the night, like 3 a.m., thinking about Bitcoin. Oh my gosh, I wonder if this is true, then it has this implication. And you're so excited. I was so happy to have something that had completely captured me intellectually. And I told my wife, I need to go meet some Bitcoin, the enthusiasts in person. So got on a plane, flew to Dallas for the BitBlock Boom conference. It was the
Mm,
second conference. It's a small Bitcoin only conference, which was even more rare at that time that you would have a conference that would distinguish itself by being Bitcoin only. So I met no shortage of incredibly bright, interesting, curious, funny individuals, um, people who had formerly worked at NASA, people who were all across the board, incredibly bright. And I thought, this is great. This is exactly what beyond my wildest expectations of a cohort of people that I would want to be with. And everyone had a positive outlook on life too, which I didn't realize. I'm a positive person, very much so generally, but that stuck out to me as a stark contrast from what I saw, I guess, in most of not only my own generation, but society, that um, because I think there is that undercurrent that fiat creates where everything is getting harder. The hamster wheel is going faster because your wealth is continuing to debase. The quality of goods and services around you, on net are decreasing. But then there is this Bitcoin crowd who are wildly optimistic about the future. So then, I do appreciate your view there, where you're more conservative and have a more tempered view, because oftentimes our community is far, too bullish or optimistic, especially in terms of timelines of adoption and those sorts of things. Um, so then 2020, I came back to that conference, flew back, and then I met Michael Tanguma, OnRamp's CEO and co-founder. I met Parker Lewis. I met many of the Unchained Capital team, and then Michael recruited me to come work at Unchained. So then I convinced my wife, she is amazing, to I would really like to work at Bitcoin, and they have an office in Austin. I would love to work there in person, be alongside them, because that was rare, and it still is fairly rare that there is a physical office where you could work side by side with others in the Bitcoin industry. And so we moved down to Austin, Texas in 2021, and have been working in Bitcoin professionally for over 4 years now.
yeah, it's when you get into Bitcoin at first, it's lonely. I
It
mean,
is.
you have to find each other, which is not something standard in, current traditional jobs because there's so many of them. Like if you work in asset management, you're going to bump into someone who works at another bank and you already have something in common to talk about. But as a Bitcoiner, even talking to friends and family can sometimes feel lonely because they tend to not go as deep as you would have, and they probably watching the headlines and the media saying I don't know how many times Bitcoin is dead, and they see these violent price moves and they think it's over, and then tulip mania. There's a lot of narratives that have been pushed on Bitcoin over the years, and every single time it comes back, and every time it comes back, it feels like it's cemented a new cohort of believers. In your case, when you started off, so you convinced the wife, worked in Bitcoin. Now, I don't know if you're okay answering this, but I mean, I'm sure a lot of your friends and family around you thought like you're crazy. What are you doing getting into this Bitcoin thing? And I'm curious to see, if you can share a little bit about, I'm sure they're funny conversations by now after what Bitcoin has done, but at the time, maybe you can share a little bit of insights on some of those conversations. What were the biggest hurdles? What did they, bring up to tell you like, "Ah, what are you doing? I mean, you should be responsible," and all that kind of stuff.
My poor, poor parents-in-law, my mother, father-in-law, because I hadn't told them I was interested in Bitcoin. I'd already had a strange career trajectory and trying to find something that I was passionate about and could be a fulfilling career and support a family and those sorts of things. And I thought, oh, and Bitcoin, just has this sordid reputation that is misconstrued. But I was like, I don't need to necessarily to voluntarily bring up to them, hey, by the way, I'm interested in Bitcoin. But all of a sudden, I find myself on a FaceTime call with my wife talking to her parents saying, hey, I'm really passionate about Bitcoin and I'm moving your grandkids to Texas to go work full time in Bitcoin. For them, they were incredibly gracious and supportive, but also I'm like, what, so out of left field. Um, friends were supportive, and same thing. They knew my interests had always been varied, and I get curious about something, and then we'll research it to the very end. Um, it's certainly shocked that it was something that I would move. Like most of my friends and family are from Minnesota, so that was a big move for us. But everyone was great. I didn't experience anyone who was incredibly negative or anything like that. I was kind of and still am a bit surprised that that move of me saying, "Hey, I'm going to leave all of you. I'm going to go work across the country," that it didn't spark more curiosity or interest in Bitcoin. But it just goes to show that, like, as you said, it either takes someone's curiosity if they're interested in something like that, or if they have a pain or a need in their life, like you had, and you need a solution like Bitcoin to secure your wealth. So it's also understandable.
Fascinating. So your first job in Bitcoin. So now you're pretty much, this is what I'm going to do with my life. I'm aligning my passion, my values, my views on,
Hmm.
hard assets with my career. I mean, I'm sure that was very fulfilling, but I'm guessing, and you can correct me if I'm saying it, was that also a client-centric sales type of job?
It was. It was.
Okay.
So primarily working with individuals, high net worth individuals to retail, family offices, and small to medium sized companies, and really helping them to understand a framework for custody. So many of the same types of conversations I have today, and incredible fulfilling work just across the board. And I was fortunate to that I met Michael and Parker in the Unchained team because Unchained too, it was one of the few Bitcoin only companies at that time. There still aren't many. So I wasn't looking for a job in Bitcoin, but I only would have worked for a Bitcoin only company.
Mhm.
And then I really appreciated the conservative nature that Unchained was taking toward custody and financial services. That I could see a lot of other companies that were uh, you know flinging the asset around, offering loans but rehypothecating. In my view, the opposite of how the asset should be managed, which is with great care, emphasis on security. Um, and being very judicious with anything around that. So all those things, once Michael started talking with me about Unchained and the opportunity, it made sense very quickly.
Interesting. So you had, that was which year when you
Early
left that?
2021.
Okay, so lots has happened since 2021, and now you've since left Unchained, and now you are head of private wealth at OnRamp. So
Hmm.
a second recruitment effort by Michael. I guess Michael really is a fan of your work, and so he made sure he got you as well. But so you've seen kind of, 4 to 5 years within the sales segment of the Bitcoin industry. So I can only imagine, and I'd love to get your real-time view of this. How were the conversations when you first started, talking about Bitcoin to prospective clients, and how are they different today with Bitcoin being, really prevalent through the ETFs that were launched last year, and in 2025, we're kicking off the year incredibly bullish with many countries talking about strategic Bitcoin reserves. So I'd love to see the contrast then and now. Has the conversation changed? Are they more receptive? Anything you can share would be really great here.
In both roles, I would say, 95% of the individuals or families I'm speaking with are already pretty have a firm thesis or a fairly firm thesis on Bitcoin. So, for instance, when I was with Unchained, Parker, Michael, and I, we would go to Dallas or Houston or Fort Worth, stand up in front of a boardroom of 20 executives, billions of dollars represented in the room, and we would give presentations just about Bitcoin generally. What is it? Why does it have value? Uh, Parker excellently would present about the great financial crisis, quantitative easing, present the problem, and help to frame what problem Bitcoin had set out to solve that Satoshi outlined. So we did do some of that. Um, but most of my time and most of our time, most of my time in the last 4 years has really been talking with folks who already understand Bitcoin well, to the point that they do have a material allocation of Bitcoin or are ready to make their first material allocation. And now they have learned that there's the second component to that investment, which is custody. That because Bitcoin is a bearer asset and it's digital and it's finite, that presents some major benefits, but also some challenges when it comes to thinking about how to secure an asset like this because we haven't had a digital bearer asset before. So most of my conversations then are providing individuals, families, family offices, companies with a framework for how to think about custody, how to think about inheritance, financial services, Bitcoin-backed loans, and help them. Largely the needs and the concerns are the same or similar for everybody. But there is some nuance depending on the situation. But I can help people to understand the risks and the threats to their Bitcoin, um, and then how to solve for those and how to weight them appropriately. So here's where some of the differences would be from 2021 to now. So 2021, within the grand scheme of things, it's not that early. Obviously, there were many other people who were working in Bitcoin far before me, but still at that time, it was somewhat unclear whether Bitcoin would be banned in the United States. Not just Bitcoin self-custody, which we were helping clients to do, but just Bitcoin generally. Um, you had to really kind of watch the news to see which way the winds were blowing. So a lot more of the conversations there could be around, well, what if Bitcoin is banned? What happens to Unchained Capital in that instance? How should I think about securing my keys to prepare for an event like that? So I do get some of those questions today, but we're in a totally different world, right? The Trump administration is incredibly pro Bitcoin and digital asset. There's no shortage of executive orders and United States uh, individually that are proposing strategic Bitcoin reserves and enshrining Bitcoin rights for the citizens of each state. Corporates adopting Bitcoin as part of their treasury strategy. Um, More folks from traditional finance, whether it be Paul Tudor Jones, Stanley Druckenmiller, who have been for a few years now strong Bitcoin proponents. So if someone comes to me now and they're talking about, what if, there was Executive Order 6102 back in 1933 that made it illegal for private citizens to own gold. What if that happens now? As I, acknowledge the risk, but let's frame that in the context of all the other risks that face you today. That risk, in my view, is far less than 1%. Here's how you can think about managing that risk. The bigger risks that you face and everyone face are inheritance, whether, death, incapacitation. We're all facing those in some sort of timeline, and we don't know what that is. Practically no one in Bitcoin has created a plan for inheritance because and not to their own fault. Largely, I would say the tooling, the infrastructure has not been there to make that easy or doable, or the risk of an investor making a mistake on their own if they're using self-custody, or if it's on an exchange, the risk of a hacker trying to hack into their account. Um, Today, the risk of physical attacks are really on the rise, and this was something that was not a concern on by any means in 2021 when the asset was 3,000 to 20,000 to 60,000 back down to 3,000, much more under the radar. Now we've hit this milestone where Bitcoin's $100,000, which is great for Bitcoin holders, wealth purchasing power increasing. It also unfortunately incentivizes nefarious actors to come out from behind the computer or their phone. There's and come into the real world, unfortunately, and kidnap and torture. And there's, every week now there's a drumbeat, especially in Europe, for whatever reason, of physical assaults. And I think you and I, Ralph, have a very positive outlook for Bitcoin's potential that it's likely within our lifetimes that one Bitcoin is worth increasingly hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, possibly tens of millions. Who knows? But from our view, I think it's fair to say we're still very early, and the potential is great. So, unfortunately, we're only going to see an increased frequency and sophistication of criminals trying to steal Bitcoin because, again, it is a bear asset. So that I'm helping a lot more people to think through that attack vector, and that's one of the things that our firm OnRamp solves for beautifully with multi-institution custody because your Bitcoin is secured behind multiple institutions. And this is why, from your world, this is why you provide the services you did, right? Your high net worth, ultra high net worth clients could not be robbed in the street for their entire net worth. That would be ridiculous. It was behind a secure bank. So that's a similar type of service we're providing. So from my point of view, some of the probabilities of the risks around Bitcoin custody have shifted, and accordingly, then the conversation has shifted. Um, that's largely what I'd say.
Yeah, so I love that. So risks in Bitcoin shift over time. So what was once a risk becomes less of a risk over time. So now, if I want to summarize what you're saying, in 2021, the big question was, is Bitcoin going to be around for the next few years? We've witnessed before that a ban in China, for example, with
Right.
a lot of the infrastructure moving. So lots of countries in Europe saying we need to ban this. Even Europe till this day isn't very friendly, but they're building regulation around digital assets. Whereas in other countries, for example, in the Middle East, the regulator took a very proactive approach where they actually built frameworks and regulation around, the space itself. Let's call it the crypto digital asset space. So with Bitcoin specifically, the risk of geopolitics has been reduced because it seems like the biggest countries in the world are taking a much more friendly approach. So we've solved for that. So that is no longer on the table. It could be, depending on where you live, but on your side of the world, it seems like that is diminishing and diminishing over time, especially now with the launch of the ETFs. It's pretty clear that, there's going to be a friendly administration and hopefully more to come into the future. So, what I would like to hone in on is right now, and I think I got it from your description of things, the biggest risk right now is how to safe keep the asset. And it's no longer about just your keys, not your coins. It's bigger than that, especially when large players, large asset allocators, extremely wealthy individuals, institutions, corporations enter that space. The current model of custody cannot accommodate them, both of the most prominent models. On one side, you have third party custody. That is just basically taking the traditional model, which all asset managers or high net worth individuals are used to, which is I go to this institution, they hold responsibility of my assets, and I'm just going to trust them because they're a brand name. Now, that has proven to be problematic, especially with a bearer asset like Bitcoin, because the difference is, BNY Mellon could disappear overnight, but they can reissue a record saying that Cam owns XYZ amount of Apple shares. Like that's not very difficult to recreate. So you're not really affected by the underlying, securities custodian. With Bitcoin, if that institution acts in a mischievous way or is mismanaged or they rehypothecate and then that institution blows up, well, no one can recreate a digital record saying you own this amount of Bitcoin because that digital record is useless if you don't actually have the Bitcoin. So I think one of the issues we saw in this mainstream adoption of Bitcoin is that they applied a model that is outdated for a bearer digital asset like Bitcoin. And I think what you said about the custody part is key because on the other side, you have self custody, which is great. I mean, everyone should have a form of self custody stack. Earlier in the conversation, I mentioned it's like your getaway bag. If the whole thing came down, I mean, you still have assets, you can move quickly with them, you can move them
Right.
to anywhere you want. So self custody is good, but self custody is not practical when you're moving $1 billion into it or even $10 million into it. And again, that segues into your issue about inheritance. Family offices, high net worth individuals. I mean, they could go down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. And I've seen that where they're extremely comfortable because they're passionate like you, like me, and it gives them pleasure to tinker and to figure out stuff. But when you look at your spouse, your family, your parents, uh, that's a bit far-fetched that you will expect them to sit there, practice, recovering a wallet, making sure that they have the necessary files, the necessary hardware, and all that stuff. And so it's like we are at this inflection point, and I love what you said about what OnRamp is doing, which is multi-institution custody. And maybe you can address, the problem with these two extremes and how multi-institution custody solves for them. One, you know, people love to have control over their assets, so maybe we can address that, how it maintains control if it does, and you can develop on that. And on the other side, how, with third party custody, you have to trust 100% a single institution. Maybe you can give us a little walkthrough on that. I think that would be helpful for everyone listening.
That's a great way to frame it. And we think of this as an evolution in Bitcoin custody, that the asset itself is 16 years old, and we as humans uh, on a meta level are still trying to figure out the best ways to interact with this foreign alien technology, that it's digital, it's a bearer asset. There's only 21 million, so the stakes are high. Like you mentioned, if it's lost forever. There's no backstop or lender of last resort or additional record somewhere else. So this really informs those characteristics of Bitcoin then inform custody. So if the asset can be lost forever, then you need redundancy. Pretty simple, right? Like everyone in the military understands this concept. You have backup communications, you have backups for your backups. You're prepared for something to go wrong in a time of war or some event going on. Um, so Bitcoin, as part of the native code or script of Bitcoin itself, there's a security script called multisig, which just means that you can secure your Bitcoin using multiple keys. All Bitcoin is secured by keys, either one key or multiple. So a standard has emerged to use multiple keys, which is called multisig. So we employed that at Unchained, and I would argue one of the firms that helped to make that a standard. One of the standards that has emerged is a 2 of 3 multi-sig. So for folks who haven't experienced this before, you can think of a safe deposit box, which has 2 keyholes and 2 keys are required to open that safe deposit box. That would be similar to what we would call a 2 of 2 multi-sig, multiple signatures required. So a 2 of 3 multi-sig has emerged as a standard where there are 3 total keys, 3 keyholes. You only need 2 out of the 3 keys to be able to, in this case, move the Bitcoin, to unlock the Bitcoin, which also means that if one key is lost or stolen or damaged, you're okay. You really try to safeguard all 3, of course, but there is a degree of fault tolerance. So that's what we work to help employ at Unchained. The client held 2 out of the 3 keys, but as you said, it's still a form of self-custody. So while it can be incredibly empowering for the individual because they control the majority of the keys, they're also taking on the preponderance of the risk. They're still trying to figure out inheritance. They're still concerned about personal attacks. If it's beyond an individual, now we're talking in a corporate, a family office, a fiduciary, in many cases, it was a non-starter or very difficult to implement because now you're trying to delineate access controls among multiple principals at both the hardware and the software level. So that's where multi-institution custody solves a number of these biggest issues that we've seen where an individual gets to benefit from many of the best aspects of self custody because we create segregated wallets for each client, and legally and operationally, they are the only one that can direct the movement of that Bitcoin. So the Bitcoin is titled in their name, in the name of their trust, their company, their family office. They are the only ones who can direct the institutions to move and sign with their keys. So there are three separate institutions. Each of the institutions holds a distinct key. So the client instructs two out of the three institutions. They verify their identity. This happens over multiple video calls. We're ensuring the client is not under duress. They are who they say they are. The withdrawal matches the controls that they've established at the outset of the account. So it's just a process of validation on their point. For them, there's no possibility of user error. There's no, if they lose their password to their on-ramp account, it's like a beautiful dashboard, looks like a private banking type experience. They can reset their password. If unfortunately someone was hacked their email account, was able to get some passwords, got their on-ramp password, whatever it might be, they're okay. That attacker is nowhere near to be able to access the Bitcoin. So for inheritance, now clients can create an on-ramp account, designate their beneficiaries, and have established legal title and making Bitcoin a non-probate asset, and have a custody solution that can practically outlive them. One that has eliminated, and this is key, eliminated a single point of failure. So that really is the core principle to Bitcoin custody. That's really the goal. And I would argue that hasn't been possible today. The last thing I'll say before I kick it back to you, Ralph, is when we're looking at the history, as you said, we have either third party custody or self custody. In most cases, if not all, a single point of failure has not been eliminated because if your Bitcoin is sitting with one institution, that institution itself is a single point of failure. It could be your account could be hacked. Your username and password is all that's protecting it. It could be insolvency by that institution. They could be rehypothecating the Bitcoin, like you mentioned. It could be malfeasance on their part, where there's internal collusion. There's no shortage of ways that can go wrong. On the self custody side, typically, even if that individual is who's primarily responsible for managing the Bitcoin, even if they're technical, they're highly diligent, they're maintaining those keys, which is not always the case, as you can imagine, because people are busy. Most people will tell you they're not technical, practically everyone. Um, they run into an issue of either those personal attacks or inheritance. How do I transfer this hundreds of hours or thousands of hours of Bitcoin custody technical knowledge between hardware and software and firmware? How do I transfer all that to a spouse, to children? Oftentimes that individual is the single point of failure. So that is really what multi-institution custody represents. Is redundancy so that an individual can comfortably allocate a material amount of their net worth to Bitcoin and then not have to worry about it. It's providing peace of mind. And you wouldn't believe how many times I'm on a video call with someone and I help them to move their Bitcoin from a self custody or exchange into multi-institution custody. I can see the physical transformation. They'll tell me like it feels like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders. It's the most fulfilling part of what I do. Like, oh my gosh, they're sweating, they're fidgeting, and then it's just kind of like a wash of calm comes
Yeah.
over them. So that's the best part of what this weird thing of multi-institution custody and why we have we taken the trouble to partner with these other institutions. Well,
Mm.
this is why it's built on the history of not only the principles and characteristics of Bitcoin itself, but the history of the other forms of custody that we've tried so far in Bitcoin.
And, I love that. Thank you for that walkthrough. And the way I view it, based on your description, it's aligning with one of Bitcoin's biggest characteristics, which is you are decentralizing custody for a
Mm,
decentralized asset. And it is really a trustless model because you no longer have to trust yourself with the keys, and nor do you have to trust one entity with the keys. So you're taking out as much of trust as possible as you can. And I just wanted to clarify one thing about the keys with these institutions, and maybe you can shed some light. They're not held on, a plastic device similar to what, self-custody proponents are doing, right? I'm assuming, based on how you describe it and some of the material I've read, is that these are institutional grade vaults. And correct me if I'm mistaken. I'll hand it back over to you.
I'm glad you asked because this is either a great misconception or most individuals just have no idea how key management is, um, what are the best practices at the institutional level. So exactly like you said, when I say that in multi-institution custody, there are three institutions and each of them holds a key, what does that mean? So for any of the three institutions in that quorum, it's not one key in the sense that it's one piece of hardware with one individual controlling it. Because for that institution, that would be a single point of failure. That would be a risk. You would not want the CEO of an institution to be targeted physically for attacks and coercion. So for their own safety, they would never want this. So yeah, this even could be a whole another podcast. Or it's I'll provide a more succinct version now. But more generally, keys can be either created via an online wallet or an offline version. They can be stored online or offline. I think it's pretty easy for someone to come to the conclusion that you want to keep Bitcoin keys offline. You want to separate the key which controls the Bitcoin from the internet connection so that it's not possible for your Bitcoin to be remotely hacked. That's just a very basic security principle. So that's called cold storage, whereas a key that is generated or connected to the internet would be considered a hot wallet or a warm wallet. So at the institutional level, all the key is created offline, stored offline, and even when that key is used to sign a transaction, it never touches an internet connected device. The transaction material is actually passed to an internet connected device via another intermediary device. Also, it's important to note that when the key is generated, that key is immediately split or sharded into multiple pieces. Those pieces then have their own quorum. So it's similar to another multisig, essentially, where there is another M of n quorum. So it might be that the single key is split into three pieces, and again, two out of the three pieces or shards of that key are required to sign and collectively sign with that one key. Or it might be a three of five or a four of seven. That ensures that now you can have multiple individuals, security professionals, executives at that single institution. Each one is responsible for a separate shard of the key. The keys are stored in separate bank grade vaults, armed guards, all the security you would expect. And that way there's a separation of duties at any single institution. So that is happening at each of the three institutions. When a client requests to withdraw from a multi-institution custody vault, it takes between 10 to 20 people between the two institutions to approve that transaction and to physically go into vaults. So you have approvals and checks at the application layer, and then in the physical real world layer, where individuals are going into vaults and using hardware devices which have been specifically created to not have access to Wi-Fi or Bluetooth to be uh, key signing and generating devices. So these are in total, the software and the hardware for key management at the institution level costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is not even in the same arena as the commonplace, still powerful, but the consumer devices, the Trezors, the Ledgers, the cold cards that we would typically associate with keys.
That's so amazing because in my head, as you were describing that, it sounds like, in the movies when they enter this vault underground and, you multiple checkpoints, video verification. You enter this room, a vault hidden, no one knows where it is in an unmarked building. So I'm glad we made that distinction. That's very helpful because it's quite easy. Like you said, people think cold storage, hardware wallets, they're thinking consumer products, a 70 to $150 device that you store at home. And one of the problems, so I've spoken to a lot of people in general in my circle, and everyone's like, yeah, multi-signature, multi-signature. That's great that you are tinkering with that. But the vast majority, I would say confidently, the vast majority, 80% to 90% of people who use multi-sig with a form of self-custody multi-signature, they store the two hardware devices in the same home and 9 times out of 10 in the same vault. Because the bigger the key quorum, like if it's a three of five, how many places are you going to hide those keys? I mean, are hiding unless you live in a mansion and have, a huge front yard. Like it's a personal operational nightmare to set it up in a way where, and if you spread them across countries, well, then if you need to access your assets, it's also going to be problematic because you can't get to them in an easy way. What if that country, is unstable and you can't go there and you have a key there, right? So I love the fact that multi-institution custody addresses a lot of these concerns. But yeah, definitely worth another more deep dive type of podcast. We'll keep it succinct just for our audience purposes who are still trying to learn about Bitcoin. And I wanted to, before we wrap it up, we're almost hitting the 1 hour mark. Cam, what's your outlook on Bitcoin? I mean, you can be pragmatic, you can be super optimistic. How do you view 2025? Do you think the United States is actually going to go through with a Bitcoin strategic reserve? There's been lots of talks about that, but now the narrative is changing to becoming a crypto strategic reserve. So I'd like to get your view on Bitcoin and how the new narrative might affect, Bitcoin in general. And the last question I'll ask you, I'll just put it right now, is for anyone that has a background in sales, whether in tech, because you can relate to that, uh, what would you recommend for them to transition into Bitcoin?
Hmm, great questions. So to the first question, I place greater than a 50% chance that the strategic Bitcoin reserve is established by the United States, I'm trying, even as I try to be conservative and not get my hopes up for that, all the signs that we've been seeing are pointing to it. If anyone, I would highly recommend individuals listening to Robert Breedlove's podcast, What is Money, with Luke Gromen, because he is one of the brightest macro thinkers. Most of that 3 hour discussion is talking about the global macro landscape. Only about 20 minutes toward the end is talking about Bitcoin, but part of what he's making the case is that at the highest levels of government, the Department of Defense, they are understanding how 50 years of fiat money has undermined our ability to manufacture goods at home, and that has really been clear in the war in Ukraine. So where does all that lead to? It leads to the need to go back to a neutral reserve currency for the world, which was gold. So is that gold or is that Bitcoin? Of course, Ralph, you and I would clearly see that it is Bitcoin. So it's quite possible that the president then and others in the administration, of which many in his cabinet are vocal Bitcoin proponents and own Bitcoin, that they understand some of these national defense concerns around the type of money that we have and the ability to continue to produce, and also the increasing national debt and the risk that that presents itself in our ability to continue to issue treasuries and find foreign buyers for them. So that in itself is a fascinating discussion. How stablecoins play into that, stablecoins being an emerging large buyer of treasuries, and that stablecoin adoption increases with Bitcoin adoption and Bitcoin increasing valuation. So it seems to be a very clear incentive, one of them, to elevate the value of Bitcoin, to increase stablecoin adoption, to increase the demand for treasuries. Um, I think there's also, Scott Bessent recently, the new Treasury Secretary, right? Yeah, or is it
Mhm.
SEC? It's just Treasury Secretary. Yeah. So it's freedom. He was able to distill it down to what so many of us would, that Bitcoin represents freedom, and he said it aligns with the principles of the Republican Party. I think many of us would say it's more apolitical, or
Mm.
it could be it appeals to members of the Democratic Party, or Libertarian Party, very much as well. But it really impressed me how many top level members of this current administration understand Bitcoin very well. Obviously, Bitcoin is a global phenomenon, but the United States leads in many ways, and many are looking toward um, what the United States economy does in monetary policy. Um,
Yeah. And
the
just to add to
executive.
that, oh
Oh,
yeah,
sure.
because you mentioned global. So just to add to that, I mean, from a game theory point of view, a lot of countries outside of the United States were worried because the United States weaponized the US dollar system. It's been quite obvious that it is not just a money rail system. It can also be weaponized at will with the Russia-Ukraine war. So yes, from a point of view, it does align with American freedom, yes, in the standard definition of the world, but it also aligns with freedom at the nation state level, the freedom to transact without using US dollar rails or SWIFT. So in every facet, there is some freedom just ingrained in the asset itself because it is not dependent, like you said, on a political party. And I think what makes it a political asset, it's its ability to be moved at will by anyone with their private key. So sorry I interrupted you, but I just want to add that lens from a global point of view. I mean, between you and me, since we're speculating here, a lot of people in the Middle East, you know, uh, they're 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 really hopeful, and I've heard people saying this, and no one will confirm it 100%. But I think when the United States officially announces that they have a Bitcoin strategic reserve, a country like the UAE, for example, might come out and say, "Yeah, we're already like 500,000 Bitcoin ahead of you."
I
Because
agree with you.
I
The
mean,
number of countries that we know of that in the GCC that are already mining Bitcoin,
yeah,
right? And Russia said publicly they're mining Bitcoin, and like there's a country that has been sanctioned by the United States, cut off from the dollar network, and now has been forced to look for other alternatives. The other thing I think I key on it is that President Trump has intuitively understood and mentioned multiple times that look, if it's one of those game theoretical decisions where if we don't do it, China will do it. It's really
yes,
that simple. The other global superpower, if it's true that there are only 21 million Bitcoin, which there are, China will do it or we will do it. We must lead. So the executive order says to make digital assets, the U.S. the leader for digital assets. How
mm,
can you be the leader in digital assets if you don't have a material position in Bitcoin or the most Bitcoin
yeah,
of any country? So, and to the crypto side, I don't. I think it's kind of political cover to call it digital assets or crypto. He received a lot of donations from
yes,
not just Bitcoin community but crypto, so I think he's making sure not to alienate the part of the broader digital assets community that helped to get him elected. And I think more practically, what will come of some of the rhetoric around supporting crypto or digital assets is more clear regulation
mm,
for everything else that is not Bitcoin. But I'm I would be surprised if anything but Bitcoin was added because I think between Senator Lummis and some of the others, there has been a recognition for many years now, even by its detractors like Gary Gensler,
mm,
that Bitcoin is a commodity. It is something separate and decentralized from whatever else the other tens of
yeah.
thousands of cryptocurrencies generously might represent.
I mean, I can live if they slide something else in it, but I'll be really upset if they slide in XRP. That's
As would
just
we all.
yeah, that's just, an internal joke for Bitcoiners. There's some like that's like Democrats versus Republicans, but in the Bitcoin world. But yeah, Cam, final question. Uh, for anyone that has a sales background, is a sales professional, whether in tech or any other sales field, what would you recommend and how would you advise them if they want to transition into the Bitcoin industry? A Bitcoin only company, let's just say.
I, I'd recommend three things. So just one is a kind of a general statement. There is a great need for sales professionals in Bitcoin for individuals who are client facing. It's often still thought that, oh, I'm not an engineer, so I really can't work in Bitcoin. There is a great need for professionals to bring their experience into Bitcoin. But then what you need a deep understanding of Bitcoin. So really immerse yourself beyond listening to podcasts, read books, read Mastering Bitcoin, understand the technical aspects of Bitcoin, run a node, uh, learn all forms of self-custody, be able to run them backwards and forwards. Single sig with a passphrase, multi-sig, collaborative custody, really be able to understand how those function personally. Um, the other thing I would say is think deeply. The second thing, think deeply about what sector of the industry you would like to work in, whether that be financial services or whether it be mining or whether it be development or core contribution, because you're going to be getting up every day and going to work and helping this industry. And when you're working in a bear market for 2 years, you really need to be dedicated to whatever it is. And that period could get long for me as well. But I am so passionate about helping people to secure their wealth. So I was always able to, have that internal fire. The third thing would be to create your own version of proof of work. So to do something that you can then show to a firm that you would like to join. Like, here's what I've done. I've started a local Bitcoin meetup. I'm educating people about how to think about different forms of self-custody. I've written some essays or provide some content because it's one thing everyone can be very enthusiastic and an avid listener of a podcast like this great one and many others, but take that above and beyond and uh, use your free time to create something of value in the world, whether it be a side project or another small business, and be able to point to that when you're talking with a prospective company.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Cam. Before we wrap it up, where can people learn more about multi-institution custody?
OnRampandBitcoin.com. That's the place where you can come. You can. I would love to chat with any listener who wants to learn more about on-ramp multi-institution custody, why we believe and know, frankly, that it will become the standard for custody in Bitcoin, based on everything we've chatted about. So you can sign up for a consultation there. Speak with myself. Speak with Michael, our CEO. We're also very active on LinkedIn. You can find our OnRamp account there. OnRamp Media on YouTube and Spotify and all the channels there, and also active on X.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today, Cam.
Thank you, Ralph. This was fun.